You know, in some respects, entrepreneurship is like a game of strategy. To be successful at the game, you need to know how the game is played and what strategies to invoke and when. Probably one of the most important entrepreneurship maxims is concerned with growing the pie. In other words, growing the value of the business while not letting the likely diminishing size of your equity share in the business blur the bigger picture of building value in the business and creating value in your diminishing equity share. It's quite natural for us to want to own 100% of the business we've been instrumental in developing. In entrepreneurship terms, we say that it is better to have, say, 30% or 60% or 80% of something rather than 100% of nothing. So in some instances, it may be far better to give away some equity in your business to an investor in return for an injection of funds which can help your business develop more rapidly. The alternative to this is to reject diluting your equity, keep it all for yourself, and reject receiving an injection of cash from an investor, and having your business grow potentially at a much slower rate. If you are going to take on an equity investor or equity investors, there's an important rule to follow, and this is that each subsequent investor must pay more for their equity than the previous investor. By doing this, you'll grow the value of the business, and while your equity is being diluted, the value of your share will increase. But of course, beware, if a subsequent investor pays less than the previous investor, then the value of your business and your equity will diminish. Let's have a look at a real-life example of what I'm talking about, of what happened to a small group of university students who developed an electronic game as part of their computer science studies at university, and after encouragement from their friends and parents, decided to commercialise that game. When they started, they had no idea whether there really was an opportunity. They only guessed that there was one based on their research. And at this point, although they started a company and owned 100% of the equity in the business, it was really worth nothing. 4 years later, their equity had been diluted from 100% to 34% after taking on a number of investors and launching an IPO, an initial public offering. But this was valued then at over $14 million. How could this be so? How could the value of their reduced equity increase so much in such a relatively short space of time? Let's take a look at what happened. We see that when the founders started the business, they invested $15,000 to cover preliminary expenses. At this point, they owned 100% of the business. A year later, an angel investor saw value in the venture and invested $500,000 for 25% of the business. And while $515,000 in funds had now been raised for the business, that is, the initial $15,000 plus the additional $500,000, the business was now valued, after the latest investment, at $2 million. Why is this the case? Well, if 25% or a quarter of the business is worth $500,000, then 100% of the business must be worth 4 times $500,000, which equates to $2 million. And since the angel investor purchased 25% equity in the business, the founders now own only 75% of the business. However, this 75% of the business is now valued at 75% of $2 million, or $1.5 million, at least on paper. And with an anti-dilution clause in place for all cash investors in the business, that is, an agreement that cash investor equity could not be diluted, only the founder's equity can be diluted. So when a venture capitalist investor purchased 18.75% equity in the venture for $1 million, the angel investor's equity of 25% remained as is, but the founder's equity decreased to 56.25%. That is, the 100% initially owned by the founders, less 25% given to the angel investor, less 18.75% given to the venture capitalist. At this point, $1,515,000 cash had been raised, but the business was now valued at $5,333,333. Why? Well, if 18.75% of the business is valued at $1 million, then 100% of the business is valued at $5,333,333. The student founders now owned only 56.25% of the business, but This placed a value of their 56.25% share of the business at $3 million. When a second venture capitalist invested $2 million in the business for 15.34% of the business, this placed a post-investment value on the business of just over $13 million, or $2 million divided by 15.34%. The founder's equity was now diluted to about 40%, but this was now valued at almost $5.5 million. Because of the cash investor anti-dilution clause, the previous investor's equity remained at 25% and 18.75% respectively. Next, a further $3 million was raised through an initial public offering, an IPO, for 6.95% equity in the venture. This occurred 4 years after the founders started the business with their $15,000 investment. And this placed a value on the business at this point of a little over $43 million. The founders' 33.96% equity was now valued at $14.5 million when the IPO concluded, 4 years after they started. And so through this real-life case study, we see the importance of growing the value of your business through subsequent rounds of equity investment, with each round at a higher price than the previous.